Welcome into the Week 11 Trends and Reactions video. You should know the deal by now, but before we get into it, I just want to remind you to please hit that subscribe button. If you like the video, give it a like. And if you like my content, give me a follow at Nate Henry FF on Twitter. All right, like I said, you probably know the drill by now, but we're going to get into some hard-hitting quick analysis from each game this week. Let's start with the Colts versus the Titans. I mentioned last week that Michael Pittman could be an interesting fantasy option if he rose to an alpha type role, and he was pretty darn close in this game. He played by far the most wide receiver snaps, 10 more than anyone else, led in targets, and turned a design run into a 21-yard gain. The running back passing involvement will always be a thorn in the side of any wide receiver tied to Phillip Rivers, but Pittman looks like a solid wide receiver 3 to me rest of season. Let's get into the Texans versus the Browns. The wind was horrible in this game, so I'm going to basically throw out everything we learned from the passing game, which is to say we learned nothing. That said, the running game data is particularly relevant here in a game that relied on it so heavily. Nick Chubb returned and looked great. He split carries 50-50 with Kareem Hunt, but Hunt played a little bit more. Regardless, Hunt carried the ball 19 total times, suggesting to me that he's fully healthy. Also notable, Duke Johnson essentially played a workhorse type role with David Johnson's sideline. That equated to 95% of the snaps, 100% of the running back carries. Duke's role is particularly notable now that David Johnson was placed on the injured reserve. Duke shines most brightly in the passing game, so I'm a little more optimistic about him moving forward, assuming he doesn't have to play a game in 30-plus mile-an-hour winds. The Washington football team versus the Lions. The Lions finally seem to have learned their lesson and stopped using Adrian Peterson so much. That finally allowed DeAndre Swift to play over 70% of the snaps, and no surprise, Swift did excellent things when he had more playing time. Talking 16 carries, 81 yards rushing, 5 targets, 68 total receiving yards, and a touchdown. Compare that to only 4 total carries for Adrian Peterson. I think if Swift were guaranteed this kind of playing time and usage, he'd be a low-end running back 1, high-end running back 2. Quick bonus impression here. J.D. Mckissick basically never leaves the field, and he's averaging 14.5 targets per game over the last 2 weeks. I think he's a great PPR option rest of the season. Buccaneers versus the Panthers. Antonio Brown looked pretty good to me in this game. He got a little more involved as the game went on, which might have been intentional since the Bucs were pretty much toying with the Panthers by halftime. Little surprised he hasn't been used more in the red zone based on his career history of scoring so many touchdowns, but it could be that Mike Williams' talent just doesn't let him. Eagles versus the Giants. Last week I said that the Eagles offense was on the rise, and boy, do I have some egg on my face after their pathetic effort against the Giants in Week 10. Their biggest issue from the eye test perspective appears to be the offensive line and pass blocking. Carson Wentz basically never can stand in a clean pocket. This is even after Lane Johnson returned, and still this offensive line cannot gel. I love the Eagles playmakers. We're talking Goddard, Rager, Fulgham, Miles Sanders. But if they cannot finish their routes before Carson is under pressure, then they really can't shine. I'm holding my Eagles for now, but my optimism has been greatly quelled. The Jaguars versus the Packers. Another windy one here, so let's not read too much into anything. Aaron Jones was somewhat inefficient on the ground, but the Jaguars were clearly selling out to stop the run. Nothing else really surprised me in this game. Most of the defined roles remained even in weird weather. Moving on to the Bills versus the Cardinals. The Bills offense has totally changed, as I predicted last week. Said differently, the Bills appear completely comfortable letting Josh Allen win the game practically on his own. Last week, he threw it 38 times. He ran it 7 times himself. Meanwhile, the running backs only ran it 11 total times. And this week, he threw it 49 times and ran it 7 times himself, compared to 11 total running back runs. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because it's basically the same game plan in 2 straight weeks. Buffalo's just basically foregoing the running game, or just making Josh Allen the entire running game. So I think the running backs in Buffalo are superfluous. Chargers versus the Dolphins. Salvon Ahmed looks fantastic. He carried the load, 21 total carries, and that was out of 25 total running back carries for the team. Plus, he played 76% of the snaps. Myles Gaskin is out at least one more week, but I think that Ahmed is played well enough to keep a role even when Gaskin comes back. Broncos versus Raiders. Drew Lock was awful in this game, playing perhaps the worst game of football I've seen all year. We're talking less than 50% completion percentage and 4 interceptions. There's some bloated stats in this game, like 10 total targets to KJ Hamler and 7 targets to Noah Fant, but these are completely deceiving. Don't be deceived. Seahawks versus the Rams. DK Metcalf got the Jalen Ramsey treatment, so I'm going to go ahead and disregard his poor performance. It is notable that he's been shut down by 2 really good corners, though. Patrick Peterson and Ramsey have shut him down, so he's not exactly the perfect wide receiver. That said, I'm more concerned about Russell Wilson's downward trends these last 2 weeks. However, it's at least worth noting that the mediocre play coincides with Chris Carson's injury. This week, Seattle actually only managed 53 total rushing yards outside of the Russell Wilson scrambles. I think that Carson makes Russ a steadier quarterback. Let's hope that's true when he comes back, maybe as soon as this week. Bengals versus the Steelers. This game was never particularly close, with the Steelers more or less running away with it, and yet Ben Roethlisberger still threw the ball 46 times. That's a 46-15 pass-to-rush ratio. The Steelers really like what they have out of their 4 main pass-catching options, Claypool, Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, Eric Ebron, because they're foregoing the run in favor of the pass in neutral and positive game scripts. That's great news for all the Steelers pass catchers, but particularly the 3 wide receivers. 49ers versus the Saints. Brandon Ayuk was everywhere. 14 total targets, 96% of the snaps. I really don't see him losing much more than a few targets here or there when Deebo returns. I think he's just too good to come off the field. All right, last game of the week, Patriots versus the Ravens. 2 things that won't show up in the box score is that Lamar Jackson and Cam Newton each underthrew a short pass that would have been an easy touchdown to their intended receiver, both of them occurring in the red zone. Lamar's pass was intended for Mark Andrews, and Cam's pass was intended for Jacoby Myers. Perhaps the nasty weather contributed to these QB misfires, but both Myers and Andrews could have had a much better day if those passes got completed. The other peripheral snaps, targets, etc. for each of these position players, talking Myers and Mark Andrews, points toward an upward trend, particularly for Andrews now that Nick Boyle's out for the year. All right, that does it for week 11. Again, make sure to hit subscribe, like it, and follow me on Twitter at NateHenryFF. Thank you very much.